Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Such gestures, though ordinary, have always marked the threshold between inquiry and initiation. Tonight, our subject is neither myth nor metaphor. It is legacy, the lingering presence of Father Dagon, and the persistent fear that still clings to Innsmouth's imagined shores. We approach not a story, but an anthropology of dread, a case study in how literature becomes folklore, and how folklore in turn becomes belief. The question, as always, is not whether the sea god exists, but why his name endures in the collective unconscious of those who have never seen the Atlantic swell. Lovecraft's creation, first named in the 1919 tale Dagon, and later immortalized in The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, stands as a cornerstone of modern cosmic horror. Yet behind this fiction lies an older current, religious syncretism, colonial anxiety, and the terror of the body's dissolution into something older than humankind. We must recognize that Dagon is not a mere monster. He is a symbol of return, of the world reclaiming what civilization pretended to master. His worshippers do not rebel against order. They reveal that order was never real to begin with. Consider carefully. By listening, by knowing his name, we participate in the same epistemic descent that claimed Innsmouth. This is not entertainment. It is contagion in the form of knowledge. We will trace the myth's origins, its philosophical depth, and its unending resurrection in culture and psychology. The investigation begins, and the tide, as always, is coming in. Before any discussion of Father Dagon's significance can occur, we must return to the historical soil from which he rose, the world of H.P. Lovecraft in the early decades of the 20th century. It is within this uneasy era, marked by social upheaval and shifting scientific frontiers, that Lovecraft forged his unique cosmology of dread. Born in Providence in 1890, Lovecraft inhabited a city still bearing the marks of colonial Puritanism and maritime trade. Its harbors once busy with ships that reached across the Atlantic to the West Indies and beyond. This environment, simultaneously provincial and decaying, became a template for Innsmouth, a fictional New England town whose isolation mirrors the psychic isolation of its creator. According to biographical accounts, Lovecraft's journeys through Massachusetts' coastal ruins during the 1920s left an indelible impression. They were not mere landscapes, but archaeological texts written in salt and mildew. It is not the sea that frightened Lovecraft, but what the sea represented. The deep time of evolution, the anonymity of the abyss, and the futility of human lineage against eternity's tide. Consider carefully the historical timing of The Shadow over Innsmouth, written 1931, published 1936, for it coincides with the Great Depression, a period of economic collapse and existential disillusionment. Coastal towns that had once thrived on fishing and trade now stood derelict, their inhabitants impoverished and inward turning. In this sociological decay, Lovecraft perceived something more than poverty. He saw degeneration, both physical and moral. The Innsmouth look, with its bulging eyes and aquatic skin, functions less as a monstrous invention than as an allegory for the perceived contamination of cultural purity. It is not simply xenophobia, but an anxiety of inheritance, of bloodlines compromised by the unknown. The hybrid beings that worship Dagon emerge, therefore, as projections of a collective fear, one grounded in both race theory and evolutionary uncertainty. Humanity's sense of exceptionalism was eroding. Darwin's legacy had made the abyss biological as well as spiritual. We must pause here to acknowledge Lovecraft's contradictory stance. A man of Enlightenment rationalism who nonetheless populated his universe with ancient gods. His writing did not celebrate faith, but revealed the collapse of reason beneath cosmic indifference. In this sense, Dagon becomes a philosophical instrument, an emblem of how science's triumph only deepens despair. The ocean, mapped and measured by modernity, still concealed depths no metric could quantify. Lovecraft's fascination with oceanography, fossils, and ancient civilizations infuses his fiction with authenticity. Yet it also transforms him into a kind of reluctant theologian of entropy. The act of creation itself mirrors descent, writing as excavation, imagination as infection. The author who sought to rationalize his world ultimately constructed a mythology of irrational order, where every rational boundary dissolves into tidal repetition. The concept of creator intent in Lovecraft cannot be confined to conscious ideology. Letters from the 1920s reveal a man simultaneously horrified and enthralled by biological mixture, cultural change, and the prospect of human insignificance. It is telling that in his early story, Dagon, 1919, the titular god, arises not in mythic antiquity, but amid the trauma of modern warfare. The narrator, a shipwrecked survivor of World War I, encounters an ancient sea idol upon a newly risen seabed, an image that encapsulates the post-war collapse of meaning. Civilization's veneer had cracked, and beneath it lay primordial chaos. Thus, Dagon's birth in fiction coincides with humanity's confrontation with its own capacity for destruction. It is not religion that returns in Lovecraft's work, but prehistory itself, intruding into the fragile present like a geological fault resurfacing after eons of dormancy. In this historical frame, the creation of Dagon was neither arbitrary nor purely literary. It emerged from a convergence of economic despair, racial anxiety, and philosophical disenchantment, a triad that defined early modern horror. The fishing villages of New England, eroded by industry and isolation, became a microcosms of humanity's existential erosion. The Esoteric Order of Dagon, Lovecraft's fictional cult, mimics the civic institutions of these towns. The Masonic Lodge, the Church, the Merchants' Guild, all now perverted into instruments of submission to the sea. This is not rebellion against civilization, but its natural consequence, a reversion to the element from which life first arose. We must recognize that Lovecraft's horror does not come from the alien, but from the ancestral, the terror that the alien is our origin and our inevitable return. Lovecraft's intent, therefore, was less to invent myth than to reconstruct it through decay. His letters repeatedly refer to the satisfaction he derived from antiquarian verisimilitude, suggesting that authenticity was central to horror's effectiveness. By embedding his mythos in familiar geography, Newburyport, Gloucester, Kingsport, he blurred the line between reportage and invention. The fictive Dagon cult becomes credible precisely because it resembles historical ones, ancient fertility sects, drowned Phoenician gods, or even local sailor superstitions. Through this blending, Lovecraft transformed New England's maritime past into a sacred geography of dread. It is not coincidence that the ocean, once the highway of exploration, becomes in his fiction the threshold of annihilation. Progress collapses into regression, curiosity into corruption. This historical context also reveals Lovecraft's self-positioning as both chronicler and participant in the decline he described. Like his doomed narrators, he too was haunted by ancestral return, financial ruin, familial madness, cultural obsolescence. The modern world's promises of progress had betrayed him, leaving only the cold comfort of intellectual detachment. Yet in that detachment lay artistic revelation. Horror as scholarship, fiction as anthropology of despair. It is here that we perceive his truest intent, not to scare, but to explain why fear is inescapable. Dagon, therefore, is not an antagonist, but a theorem, a proof that humanity's myths are merely reflections in deeper waters. Ultimately, when we examine the historical and psychological conditions of Lovecraft's authorship, Dagon stands revealed as an avatar of return. His creation in 1919 and resurrection in 1931 chart a personal mythology evolving in parallel with a civilization losing faith in its own progress. The myth does not emerge from imagination alone, but from observation, from tide pools of memory, from ruins of industry, from the shifting face of a world that had grown old. The figure of Dagon reminds us that horror is not an interruption of history, but its continuation. As the coastal towns of Lovecraft's youth decayed into myth, so too did reason dissolve into ritual. The bridge between history and myth had always been made of salt. Thus, in tracing the creator's intent, we uncover not invention, but inheritance. Lovecraft's fiction as the heir to millennia of maritime awe and theological terror. His Dagon embodies the modern consciousness drowning in its own enlightenment, a civilization haunted by its prehistoric parentage. And as we turn from context to origins, toward the deeper cultural and philosophical antecedents that shape this sea god's identity, We follow the same path the author traced, from observation to obsession, from scholarship to surrender. The next section, then, will descend into those older waters where history gives way to archetype, and Dagon ceases to belong to Lovecraft alone. To understand Father Dagon, not as invention, but as continuation, we must trace his genealogy through the long and murky stream of maritime religion, mythic anthropology, and philosophical speculation about the sea. The figure that Lovecraft resurrected was already ancient long before. The shadow over Innsmouth gave him new life. Dagon appears in the archaeological record as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, worshipped among the Amorites and later among the Philistines as a deity of grain and fertility, later reinterpreted through Greco-Roman and biblical lenses as a hybrid of man and fish. Yet even here the confusion begins, for his name, derived from the Semitic dag, meaning fish, was likely a later folk etymology rather than original doctrine. What Lovecraft seized upon was not accuracy but aura, the image of a god whose body blurred species boundaries, whose temple fell before the Ark of Israel, whose defeat in Scripture masked a deeper symbolic victory. It is not faith that survived those millennia, but form, the recurring archetype of the aquatic divinity who mediates between land and abyss, humanity and the unhuman that preceded it. Ancient cultures repeatedly imagine life emerging from the waters, and in this shared motif, Dagon becomes a universal ancestor rather than a parochial god. Mesopotamian myths spoke of Oans, the fish-clad teacher who rose from the Persian Gulf to instruct mankind in writing, agriculture, and law. The Greeks told of Triton and Glaucus, divine intermediaries between mortal and abyssal realms. Even early Christian iconography under the ichthys symbol reappropriated the fish as emblem of salvation and rebirth. Thus the sea, both womb and tomb, became the stage upon which humanity projected its first philosophy, that life and knowledge are cyclical, rising from and returning to the same in different depths. Lovecraft, reading these traditions through an early 20th century lens of materialist pessimism, inverted their optimism. Where ancient waters birthed civilization, his depths reclaimed it. It is not the god who blesses the shore, but the shore that drowns in its ancestral god. We must recognize that beneath the literary veneer of Lovecraft's mythos lies an anthropological continuity. The cult of Dagon in The Shadow over Innsmouth mirrors in miniature the syncretic practices of ancient port cities, those liminal zones, where traders, languages, and beliefs collided. Just as Joppa, Tyre, and Ugarit absorbed foreign deities through commerce, Innsmouth becomes a vessel of cultural contamination. The worship of Father Dagon, mingling fragments of Christian liturgy with pagan invocation, recalls the adaptive strategies of syncretic faiths from Haiti to the Mediterranean basin. Anthropologically, such hybridization arises wherever survival demands alliance with the alien. Economically, it reflects the logic of trade. Spiritually, it manifests the terror of dependence upon the unknown sea. In Lovecraft's fictional anthropology, the same process becomes monstrous. The townspeople's pact with the Deep Ones mirrors humanity's historical willingness to negotiate with chaos for prosperity. It is not a reversal of history. It is history seen without moral disguise. Philosophically, the antecedents of Dagon extend beyond religion into metaphysical speculation about the ocean itself. From Heraclitus's notion of flux to Lucretius's vision of atomistic turbulence, the sea has served as metaphor for becoming, for dissolution, for the instability of all forms. Medieval theologians called it mare tenebrosum, the dark sea of uncreation. Enlightenment thinkers, fascinated by natural philosophy, measured its tides and depths only to confront their own epistemic limits. In this long intellectual lineage, Lovecraft's Dagon becomes the ultimate synthesis, the sea not as setting, but as principle. It is the visible face of entropy, the embodiment of the universe's refusal to maintain boundaries. Consider carefully the philosophical progression, from creation through evolution to dissolution. Dagon personifies not creation or destruction, but the continuum between them, a theological entropy in motion. It is not coincidence that Lovecraft's resurgence of Dagon occurs in an age dominated by Darwin, Freud, and Nietzsche, three figures who collectively dismantled the human-centered cosmos. Darwin dissolved humanity's divine isolation. Freud revealed the irrational depths beneath the mind. Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God. In this philosophical climate, Dagon returns as the sea's counter-theology, a god who thrives precisely where divinity dies. His existence is not miracle but mechanism, not revelation but recurrence. Where older faiths promise transcendence from matter, the Lovecraftian cosmos offers only immersion in it. Humanity is not the image of God. It is a temporary form of marine sediment. Thus, Dagon functions as both relic and prophecy, a reminder that philosophy, once severed from transcendence, circles back to myth. The fish god is no longer an idol, but a metaphor for thought's own drowning. To this we must add a psychological dimension, the ocean's symbolic role as repository of the unconscious. Long before Lovecraft, the Romantics and symbolists had already linked the sea with dream and dissolution. In Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 1798, the mariner's ordeal unfolds upon waters slimy and still, where spiritual guilt and natural horror converge. Baudelaire's L'Homme et la Mer, 1857, transforms the sea into a mirror of human restlessness and self-loathing. By the time Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900, water had become a universal metaphor for psychic depth. Lovecraft's appropriation of the ocean inherits this tradition but removes its redemptive possibility. His waters are not subconscious but subhuman, not a wellspring of insight, but a reminder of biological descent. The worshippers of Dagon do not awaken to truth. They regress toward origin. The dream, once therapeutic, becomes terminal. The continuity of the fish god across cultures therefore reveals something profound about humanity's self-conception. In every epoch, the ocean symbolizes both boundary and origin, both terror and truth. Lovecraft's innovation was to strip the sea of benevolence, leaving only the mechanism of recurrence. It is not accident that his myth emerged from a coastal society defined by industrial exhaustion, nor that his prose echoes the tone of scientific report rather than scripture. By synthesizing ancient myth, Enlightenment skepticism, and modern existentialism, he created a Dagon suitable for the 20th century, a god without faith, sustained only by recognition. What earlier ages worshipped, modernity remembers with dread. Thus, the cultural and philosophical antecedents of Dagon reveal the god as cumulative myth, a palimpsest written over by millennia of human anxiety. From Mesopotamian altars to New England pulp magazines, the same pattern persists. The sea offers power, humanity bargains for survival, and in that transaction, something essential is lost. As we proceed, we must move from these broad antecedents toward the linguistic and symbolic mechanisms that carry the myth forward. If Dagon is continuity incarnate, then language is his vessel, the tide by which ancient fear reaches modern consciousness. The next section will examine how words themselves, their etymology and mutation, serve as conduits for the deep. The myth of Father Dagon survives not merely through narrative repetition, but through the careful cultivation of symbolic language, a lexicon of fish, salt, tide, and chant that operates not only on a semantic level, but a psychological one. In Lovecraft's mythopoeic practice, language is not neutral. It is diseased, degraded, and deliberately destabilized. The very name Dagon, pulled from ancient Semitic roots, dag meaning fish, anchors the character in a linguistic net that stretches from Mesopotamian temples to the King James Bible. Yet this apparent clarity dissolves upon inspection. Archaeological and philological evidence suggests that the Philistine Dagon was originally a grain deity, with the fish association being a later, likely erroneous interpretation. And yet, this error is precisely the vector by which the myth survives. Lovecraft seized on the folk etymology, not in spite of its falsity, but because of its evocative power. In myth, the false that is believed becomes more durable than the true that is forgotten. Dagon's persistence is less historical than phonetic, a name that sounds like water. We must recognize how Lovecraft's use of names, Dagon, Yaha-Enthle, Hydra, reflects a calculated semiotic strategy. These terms operate at the edge of pronunciation, invoking the uncanny not just in their meanings, but in their morphology. They resemble real words without conforming to linguistic rules, causing discomfort at a cognitive level. This is not gibberish, but what scholars might call liminal language, terms designed to hover between sense and nonsense. Yahantley, the Deep One's underwater city, mimics Semitic and Polynesian phonetics while remaining stubbornly untranslatable. Such naming techniques evoke both the alien and the ancient, constructing an illusion of authenticity through fragmentation. The reader is not meant to understand but to suspect, to feel that something lies beneath the surface, unreachable and yet familiar. These names are not labels, but symptoms, linguistic lesions left by something older than articulation. Consider the symbolic language that saturates the shadow over Innsmouth. The recurring imagery of fish, scales, watery eyes, and gills functions as more than descriptive detail. It forms a visual lexicon of transformation and decay. When Lovecraft describes the hybrid townspeople's features as queer, rubbery, or unwholesomely moist, he is not merely invoking disgust. He is using tactile and olfactory language to destabilize the reader's sensorium. Fish, in Western semiotics, are traditionally associated with Christianity, as in the ichthys, with wisdom, as in the fishhook parables, and with fertility. Lovecraft corrupts these associations, turning fish into symbols of regression and blasphemy. It is not life that these creatures represent, but life misused, biology without soul, continuity without identity. This inversion of traditional symbolism is one of Lovecraft's most disturbing linguistic tools. It is not simply a monster in a story. It is the betrayal of a symbol that once promised meaning. One must also attend to the ritualistic cadence of the cult speech within the story. The invocations uttered in the Esoteric Order of Dagon, phrases like, "Dagon shall rise," or "the Deep Ones know," mimic liturgical repetition. This is a deliberate parody of ecclesiastical language, transforming salvation into submersion. Much like Gnostic or Manichaean sects in late antiquity, the order claims access to a secret truth that contradicts surface reality. Their language reflects this secrecy. The deeper meanings are veiled, accessible only through initiation. Lovecraft's fictional rites resemble those of real-world mystery religions, with their chants, sacraments, and oaths of silence. What emerges is a theology of concealment, where words protect as much as they reveal. Language here becomes a barrier, an obfuscating membrane like the sea itself. It both connects and separates, hinting at the hidden city below, while ensuring its inaccessibility to the uninitiated. Etymologically speaking, Lovecraft's mythos plays upon linguistic memory, those echoes of older tongues embedded in contemporary language. Words like Innsmouth carry more than geographic implication. They blend English place-naming conventions with Gothic tonal resonance. Mouth evokes not only a river's end, but also ingestion, voice, and monstrous opening. Inns suggest lodging, transience, shelter before transformation. Thus, Innsmouth is not merely a town. It is a linguistic construction of becoming, of passage from human to other. Likewise, Arkham, Dunwich, and Kingsport evoke Puritan and medieval tones, suggesting hidden texts and suppressed heresies. These invented names create a sense of historical layering, as though Lovecraft's New England had always been haunted, not by ghosts, but by syllables that never meant what they seemed. This symbolic destabilization extends even to the structure of his sentences. Lovecraft's prose famously resists modernist concision, favoring elaborate subordinate clauses and archaic diction. This syntactic excess serves a purpose. It mimics the experience of mental disintegration. Clauses pile upon clauses, often evoking a narrator on the brink of revelation or madness. His sentences are not merely descriptive. They are architectural, tunnels through which the reader descends. And this descent is both linguistic and philosophical. The closer one reads, the more unstable the meaning becomes. Words which ought to clarify instead confuse. Language itself becomes the medium of infection. Ultimately, what Lovecraft achieves through etymology and symbolic language is a kind of textual contamination. The names linger in the reader's mind not because they are memorable, but because they feel incomplete. They are partial utterances of something deeper, just as Dagon is not a character, but a syllable pointing to an unspoken totality. The ocean's abyss is mirrored in linguistic depth, a sense that meaning stretches downward, indefinitely. This is no accident. For Lovecraft, as for the Gnostic traditions he echoes, knowledge is not illumination, but descent. And descent requires a language not of light, but of murk. As we transition into the final subsection of this part, we must ask, how does this language, this semiotic ocean of invented names, inverted symbols, and syntactic collapse, support the illusion that Dagon and his deep ones are real? The next section will explore how Lovecraft constructs narrative authenticity through myth-building techniques that mimic ethnographic, religious, and archaeological documentation. If language is the infection, then myth is the delivery system, and Lovecraft, ever the antiquarian, knew exactly how to make fiction feel like history. To fully grasp the disturbing endurance of Father Dagon in the cultural imagination, we must now turn from language to structure, from words to worlds. Lovecraft's mythos gains its power not through explicit horror, but through the slow accumulation of verisimilitude, the illusion that one is encountering history rather than invention. This is the essence of myth building, not the creation of fantasy, but the suggestion of deep cultural sediment. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, reads not as a tale, but as a case file. Lovecraft weaves his narrative from the threads of pseudo-scholarship, government cover-ups, eyewitness testimonies, suppressed genealogies, mimicking the conventions of anthropological and archaeological texts to grant his fiction the gravity of forgotten truth. Consider carefully how effective this device is. By positioning the reader as an investigator, not a spectator, Lovecraft transforms horror into complicity. Lovecraft often used invented texts as anchors, books like the Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, or the Ponape Scriptures, to situate his stories within an alternate bibliographic history. These grimoires, though fictitious, are cited with such specificity, including invented authors, publishing dates, and translations, that they mimic the logic of scholarly citation. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator uncovers local lore, genealogical records, and whispered tales that mirror the methodologies of ethnographic fieldwork. We are told about Captain Obed Marsh's voyages, the founding of the Esoteric Order of Dagon, and the eventual government raid, all detailed with the detached tone of a historical report. This tactic does not invite belief in the literal, but in the atmospheric, a sense that Innsmouth is not invented, but discovered. Lovecraft doesn't ask us to believe. He demands that we doubt what we know. We must recognize the mythic sleight of hand at work. Lovecraft does not build his mythos from raw invention, but through recontextualization. He borrows the structures of real-world secret societies, the Masons, Rosicrucians, and Theosophists, infusing his cults with believable rituals, hierarchies, and esoteric terminology. The Esoteric Order of Dagon, with its use of formal ranks, hidden chambers, and ritual speech, mirrors the public secrecy of such orders. But Lovecraft adds another layer, racial transformation. Where the Masons promise enlightenment, Dagon's cult promises bodily metamorphosis, immortality through hybridity. This inversion of the Enlightenment tradition becomes one of Lovecraft's darkest conceptual turns. The idea that beneath the surface of every attempt to master the world lies a darker impulse to surrender to it. The geography of Innsmouth plays an essential role in maintaining narrative authenticity. Lovecraft carefully situated his fictional towns, Arkham, Dunwich, Kingsport, and Innsmouth, along the Massachusetts coast, blending actual cartography with invented histories. He describes roads, train routes, and social customs in such detail that the illusion of place becomes harder to untangle than the stories themselves. In doing so, he echoes the techniques of Victorian novelists like Thomas Hardy, who invented entire Wessex counties grounded in real-world topography. But while Hardy used such strategies to explore human morality and fate, Lovecraft deployed them to explore contagion. Innsmouth does not merely exist in space. It infects the mental geography of the reader. One begins to wonder whether some towns are forgotten by time because they were never meant to be remembered. Consider also the narrator's role in shaping our sense of realism. In many of Lovecraft's stories, particularly Innsmouth, the narrator is initially skeptical, even dismissive. This skepticism mirrors the presumed stance of the reader, creating a parallel descent into belief. As the narrator uncovers the town's secrets, Abnormal physiognomies, secret rituals, missing townspeople, he mirrors the process of academic discovery, field notes turning into theory. But the final twist, that the narrator himself is of Deep One descent, collapses the divide between observer and subject. This is a metafictional stroke. The scholar becomes the specimen, the reader becomes the rewritten. The authenticity of the narrative is not just external, it is internalized. The more one learns, the less human one becomes. This recursive structure, the sense that discovery leads to transformation, mirrors actual folkloric systems. In anthropological terms, belief systems gain durability when they incorporate participation. The rituals of the Esoteric Order of Dagon are not just observed by the townspeople, they are enacted, embodied, and inherited. Genealogy becomes liturgy. Unlike Gothic horror, which isolates its monsters in castles or crypts, Lovecraft distributes monstrosity through bloodlines and community. Innsmouth's horror is municipal, not individual. The entire town becomes a sacred text, one written in architecture, diet, note the town's obsession with fish, and facial structure. The myth feels real because it reflects the way real myths operate, through slow absorption into the everyday. Ultimately, Lovecraft's most profound myth-building technique lies in his refusal to resolve. His stories end with ambiguity, suppression, or dissent, not with closure. The Shadow over Innsmouth concludes with the narrator planning to return to the sea, not to defeat Dagon, but to join him. There is no final confrontation, no exorcism of evil, only submission. In this way, the narrative structure itself becomes part of the myth. Unfinished, circular, infectious. As scholars of mythology have noted, the most enduring myths are those that resist interpretation. They are not puzzles with solutions, but mirrors with distortions. Dagon does not need to be explained because he has already been felt. As we now move from the structural mechanics of the myth into its philosophical implications, we must leave behind the comforting fiction of fictionality. The myth has been built, the stage set. The names have taken root, the rites described, the history falsified into believability. What remains is to understand the why. In the next section, Part 2, we will descend into the abyssal core of the myth itself, examining its philosophical structures, the nature of the entities involved, and the epistemic terror they unleash. The mask of narrative has slipped. What stares back is not a god, but something older. In the corpus of cosmic horror, no philosophical theme looms larger than the assertion of human insignificance. Father Dagon, as both figure and force, operates less as a singular entity and more as a philosophical provocation, an argument carved into myth. His emergence from the deep sea reflects not the arrival of a monstrous god, but the revelation of humanity's provisional place in an ancient, ongoing ecology of existence. Lovecraftian horror, we must remember, does not scream, it whispers, suggesting that the horror lies not in destruction, but in recognition. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, when the narrator slowly uncovers the biological and cultural reality of the Deep Ones, his horror is not sparked by violence or malevolence. It is born from the realization that he is not exceptional. I was a part of it now, he confesses in the story's closing. A part of that nighted, watery world of wonders and terrors. This moment embodies the first great principle of Dagonic horror. To know is to descend. Historically, Western philosophical tradition, from Plato to Kant, elevated humanity as rational center, sovereign mind among blind mechanisms. But in the early 20th century, that scaffolding began to collapse. The discoveries of Darwinian evolution, the dissolution of Newtonian absolutes, and the rise of psychoanalysis converged to dethrone man from his pedestal. In this destabilized context, Lovecraft constructed his own mythic cosmology, one in which the old theological void had not been filled, but simply flooded. Dagon, in this model, becomes less a deity and more an assertion of scale, an indifferent elder being whose very existence displaces anthropocentric significance. He does not persecute humanity. He subsumes it, silently, like rising tides, do cities built too close to the shore. We must consider entropy as the second great axis of Dagon's philosophical function. Where classical horror thrived on the disruption of order, cosmic horror exposes the illusion that order ever existed. The sea, endless, unstable, and encroaching, is the natural metaphor for entropy. It reshapes, erodes, and reclaims. It does not destroy arbitrarily, but simply waits. Dagon is entropy personified. In Dagon, 1919, the narrator recounts the sudden emergence of a seafloor landscape where slimy things with great arms move with ancient purpose. His descent into madness is not a reaction to violence, but to duration. The realization that the world beneath the waves is older, more stable, and more enduring than the world above. What terrifies him is not that such things exist, but that they have always existed, while humanity's tenure is recent and fragile by comparison. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror is not the fear of death, but of irrelevance within a larger, indifferent system of decay. Lovecraft's articulation of entropy parallels the rise of thermodynamic and biological pessimism in early 20th century science. The second law of thermodynamics, positing that all systems move toward maximum disorder, became a metaphor for existential despair. We must pause here to reflect on this alignment. Dagon's myth does not contradict science. It embodies its implications. The cult of Dagon in Innsmouth is not merely religious. It is ecological, evolutionary, and entropic. By worshipping the sea, they align themselves with that which cannot be resisted: decline, transformation, eventual absorption. This is not apostasy. It is acquiescence. And in Lovecraft's universe, acquiescence is wisdom, madness only to those who still believe in order. But entropy is not merely physical, it is cognitive. The dreamlike quality of Lovecraft's fiction, particularly in Innsmouth and its surrounding mythos, introduces a final axis: the collapse of the distinction between dream and reality. This is the third philosophical principle we must examine. The narrator's journey in The Shadow over Innsmouth blurs this boundary with increasing instability. By the conclusion, when he dreams of swimming freely with his deep one, kin, in the ruins of Yahanthle, there is no longer a clear line between memory, vision, and identity. In that dream, I saw a great underwater city, lit by many phosphorescent fungi, and full of very old stone buildings and statues. The sea here is not just a place, it is a psychic realm, a liminal state between waking and surrender. Dagon's power is not merely physical transformation, but epistemic destabilization. He reorders the mind. Dreams, in cosmic horror, are not metaphors for unconscious desire. They are warnings from a reality that cannot be grasped while awake. Lovecraft's narrators do not wake up from their dreams. They awaken into them. In this inversion, the dreamlands and the deep ones represent the same epistemological crisis, that our perceptions are unreliable, our consciousness porous. The descent into the sea becomes a descent into the real. In this schema, Dagon is not a monster beneath the surface. He is the truth beneath the dream of human dominance. What we call madness may simply be the mind adjusting to a deeper register of reality. This thematic convergence of insignificance, entropy, and dream reality reveals the essential structure of Lovecraft's philosophical horror. It is not the singular revelation that destroys the self, but the cumulative erosion of assumptions over time. Dagon does not shatter the ego. He wears it down like the tide wears down stone. And it is no accident that the narrators of these tales do not die in terror, but continue. Transformed, yes, but alive. Their minds change, their shapes change, their loyalties shift. The horror is not extinction, but adaptation without consent. It is not punishment, it is inheritance. Consider this carefully. In the end, Dagon is not an external threat. He is our origin and our return. The sea is not hell, it is home. This is the ultimate reversal that cosmic horror proposes. The monsters are not invaders, they are ancestors. And knowledge, far from empowering us, reveals our untenable position in a cosmos governed not by intention, but by unrelenting cycles. The implication lingers long after the page is turned. If the sea calls, we must answer, not as individuals, but as species, as sediment, as memory. As we move forward to examine the beings who inhabit this dream realm of decline, the deep ones, the dreamland's dwellers, and the ambiguous entities like Dagon and Hydra. We must keep in mind this triadic structure of Lovecraftian dread. Insignificance, entropy, and dream reality are not separate ideas. They are one current, pulling every myth, every being, every belief into the depths. The surface trembles, but it is the undertow that claims us. If we are to take Father Dagon seriously, not as a fantasy, but as a metaphysical proposition, then we must examine the broader ecology in which he resides. Dagon is not alone. He is neither supreme nor autonomous. Rather, he is one node in a vast and disjointed pantheon of cosmic beings whose relationships to one another are as uncertain as their meanings. These entities, commonly grouped under the informal title of the Old Ones or Great Old Ones, form an anti-hierarchy in which agency is decentered, power is ambient, and consciousness may be entirely alien. Unlike the structured pantheons of classical myth, Lovecraft's beings do not rule. They persist. They exist not to be worshipped, but to be endured. To study Dagon is to map his coordinates within this submerged theological terrain, where gods are also species, and divinity is indistinguishable from biology, memory, or mass hallucination. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, Dagon appears most immediately in conjunction with Mother Hydra, a figure who is frequently invoked alongside him in the rites of the Esoteric Order. Their names suggest a duality, male and female, paternal and maternal, generative and consuming. Yet, these designations are unstable. Mother Hydra is never physically described. Dagon, when glimpsed in visions or hinted at through sculpture, remains ambiguous in size, form, and substance. Are they true deities, mythologized deep ones, or something more? We must pause here. Lovecraft deliberately blurs the distinction. He withholds taxonomy, perhaps to emphasize a deeper point, that classification itself is a human imposition, and that the entities it seeks to contain may operate along dimensions for which language is wholly insufficient. Dagon may be god or progenitor, symbol or organism, manifestation or mask of something far older. Consider, then, the deep ones, those semi-aquatic, quasi-immortal beings who serve, worship, and eventually become Dagon's children. Their role is central to both Innsmouth and the philosophical structure of cosmic horror. They embody the horror of hybridization, of species flux, and of the collapse between the known and the unknown. But they are not mere monsters. Lovecraft gives them a culture, a history, even a utopia of sorts in Yhanthle. They are not evil, they are ancient. Their acts are not malicious, but evolutionary. They live indefinitely, reproduce across species boundaries, and sleep within coral palaces deeper than any submarine can reach. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, they emerge not as invaders, but as relatives. Their connection to Dagon is ambiguous. They worship him, perhaps. Or perhaps he is simply the name humans gave to the deep forces that shaped their species. In this ambiguity lies their power. They are not allegory, they are ontological drift. It is not Dagon alone who terrifies, but the suggestion that he is only the local representative of something larger. Throughout Lovecraft's mythos, Dagon appears as a regional deity, a coastal avatar of the same forces that animate Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, or Azathoth. Each of these entities represents a different dimension of cosmic horror. Cthulhu is dreaming embodiment, Nyarlathotep is cruel interface, Azathoth is blind chaos. Dagon, by contrast, is not a cosmic principle but a bridge between human and deep one, land and sea, known and unknowable. We must recognize this functional role. Dagon is the threshold god. His presence signals contact. His cult marks the liminal moment when tradition breaks and myth reasserts itself. He is not a destination, but a current. He carries the human subject toward dissolution. Beyond earthly shores, Dagon's conceptual cousins populate the dreamlands, a secondary cosmology within Lovecraft's work, where the laws of physics soften and archetypes crystallize. Entities like the night gaunts, the zoogs, or the gods of Kadath suggest that Dagon may be part of a much older dream ecology in which the sea is only one realm among many. The dreamlands are not escapist fantasy. They are philosophical territory, where the unconscious interfaces with metaphysical reality. Dagon's presence in both sea and dream hints at an interdimensional function. He is not merely a god of water, but of transition, from land to sea, from waking to sleep, from self to species. This reveals something profound. Dagon, like all Lovecraftian beings, is a vector. His horror is not what he is, but what he connects. The very existence of such entities implies a universe too vast for comprehension and too old for comfort. Rhetorically, the invocation of multiple names, Father Dagon, Hydra, Cthulhu, mirrors the syncretism of real-world religion. It reflects not clarity, but the persistence of belief through distortion. Dagon may be a mask of Cthulhu, or a servant, or a fragment, or a dream form of something even more vast. But in all cases, the structure is the same. The human mind touches the edge of a being it cannot contain, and, in doing so, begins to dissolve. The deep ones offer a model of what this dissolution looks like biologically. Dagon models it theologically. The great old ones model it cosmologically. They are not enemies of reason, they are its perimeter. And beyond that perimeter is the sea. We must ask, why do these beings allow contact at all? Why dreams? Why rituals? The answer, if one exists, is chilling. Perhaps they do not allow anything. Perhaps they are simply there, and consciousness, like a sonar ping, occasionally returns with an answer it was never meant to receive. Dagon, in this framework, is not calling. He is merely resonating, and those who hear him, through dreams, bloodlines, or madness, are not chosen, but exposed. This is the final lesson of Lovecraft's theology. There are no miracles, only frequencies, and Dagon is one of them. As we move next into the domain of human interaction, the madness, cults, and epistemic corrosion that always follow contact, we will see that the horror is never limited to the entity itself. The true terror lies in the echo, in the minds it alters, the communities it deforms, the languages it corrodes. Dagon is not the end of the myth. He is only the opening tide. The real drowning happens in the mind. The essence of cosmic horror is not found in the monstrous itself, but in what the monstrous does to the human subject. Nowhere is this more evident than in the case of Father Dagon and his children beneath the waves. Unlike traditional horror antagonists, the deep ones and their pantheon do not pursue or torment for pleasure or punishment. They exist, and it is their existence, alien, ancient, indifferent, that fractures the human mind. Madness, in Lovecraft's world, is not an aberration. It is the inevitable outcome of comprehension. Those who interact with Dagon, directly or indirectly, undergo a cognitive reorientation so profound that it cannot be contained within the architecture of the rational self. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the narrator's descent into revelation does not culminate in death or victory. It culminates in acceptance, a quiet madness masked as metamorphosis. I shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea and descend through black abysses, he writes, to Cyclopean and many-columned Yuhan-Thle. Madness here is not collapse, it is arrival. We must recognize the ritualistic structure embedded within these transformations. Human contact with Dagon typically follows a three-part progression: encounter, obsession, and inheritance. First comes the encounter, usually accidental through dreams, archaeology, or forbidden lore. Then obsession. The subject begins to research, to see patterns, to make connections that others dismiss. Finally, inheritance. The realization that one is not merely an observer of the mythos, but its product. The narrators of Dagon, 1919, and Innsmouth follow this arc, as do countless other characters in Lovecraft's wider mythos. This is not a narrative device. It is a philosophical mechanism. The mythos cannot be studied without being internalized. It is not simply a story of fear. It is a meditation on cognitive vulnerability. In this context, madness serves a dual purpose. On one hand, it protects the human mind from irreparable rupture by muting the full force of cosmic revelation. On the other, it marks the individual as permanently altered, a liminal figure straddling two epistemologies, the rational and the eldritch. Scholars have compared this function to religious ecstasy or shamanic dissociation, in which contact with the divine or the inhuman results in psychic fragmentation followed by transformation. But we must pause here. Lovecraft inverts this trope. In cosmic horror, the divine is not compassionate, nor is the inhuman enlightening. It is not revelation in the traditional sense. It is displacement. The self does not return with new wisdom. The self dissolves into the message. Consider the townspeople of Innsmouth. Their madness is not psychosis in the medical sense. It is cultural transvaluation, a complete reordering of values, language, and identity. Their hybrid lineage with the Deep Ones produces a physiological marker, the Innsmouth look, but it is the psychological alignment that truly terrifies. These people are not deceived or cursed. They are content. Their rituals are not frenzied but methodical. Their eyes do not dart wildly. They gaze with purpose. This reveals something profound. Madness, in the Lovecraftian sense, is not disorder. It is order of a different kind. An epistemic realignment suited to truths that human consciousness was never designed to contain. Dagon does not drive men mad through cruelty. He renders them obsolete through knowledge. We must also account for the role of secrecy and suppression in facilitating this process. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the U.S. government stages a raid on the town, obliterating Yahanthle and seizing key cult leaders. Yet, even this act of violence is framed as containment, not confrontation. The narrator himself notes that officials downplay the event, and no lasting record remains. This recurring theme in Lovecraft, of authorities suppressing knowledge too dangerous for the public, serves as a mirror for the madness function. Civilization itself conspires to maintain the illusion of order. The few who discover the truth are discredited, institutionalized, or simply vanish. Madness, then, becomes not a personal failing, but a societal filtration system. Those who see too much are quietly removed. Rhetorically, Lovecraft repeatedly uses language that blurs the line between sanity and clarity. Terms like queer, hideous, and unnameable do not describe pathology, they describe thresholds. The narrators stand on the cusp of two realities, and language fails them. We must ask, is the narrator insane, or has he simply crossed into a reality where our vocabulary no longer applies? This question, which reoccurs across Lovecraft's stories, is central to the madness function. It is not a narrative twist. It is a philosophical provocation. What if sanity is merely a perceptual bias, and madness is the first honest response to the universe as it truly is? Consider the case of Obed Marsh, the sea captain who brings Dagon's worship back to Innsmouth. His madness is not erratic, but systematic. He forms a cult, makes calculated alliances, and reorders the town's economy around Deep One contact. His decisions are rational by any local metric, and yet, from the outside, they appear monstrous. This tension invites a broader reflection. Perhaps madness, in the mythos, is only the word we assign to beliefs that outlive their cultural container. The line between religion, ideology, and psychosis becomes, under Dagon's influence, too slippery to hold. Thus, human interaction with Dagon inevitably results in transformation, not because Dagon demands it, but because reality does. Madness is not a punishment for heresy. It is the effect of encountering a cosmos where the human is not privileged, not protected, and not permanent. As we move to examine the final thematic pillar, forbidden knowledge and epistemic collapse, we will see that madness is not the end of the process. It is the beginning. The mind breaks not because it has failed, but because it has succeeded in perceiving too much. And in the waters of that perception, Dagon waits. Among all the themes that circulate through Lovecraft's mythos, none is more central, more corrosive, or more insidious than the idea of forbidden knowledge. It is a knowledge that does not illuminate, but instead unravels. To learn of Father Dagon is not to gain power, but to lose position within one's former worldview. The act of knowing becomes self-negating. In this way, Dagon functions not only as a monstrous deity, but as a metaphysical trap, a symbol of truth so ancient, so deeply embedded in the substratum of the world, that the mere act of discovering them initiates the slow-motion collapse of the knower. Lovecraft does not offer us a god who punishes inquiry. He offers us a universe in which inquiry itself is punishment. And in that structure, Dagon becomes a philosopher's nightmare, a being whose existence proves that understanding is indistinguishable from annihilation. This function is made literal in The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the narrator's gradual uncovering of the town's aquatic secret mirrors a descent through successive layers of epistemic disintegration. Initially, the mystery seems folkloric: bizarre architecture, suspicious townsfolk, secretive cults. But with each revelation, the narrator's world loses coherence. His sense of historical continuity, biological distinction, and even personal identity is steadily eroded. By the end, the horror is no longer external. It is genetic. "I think their main object is to preserve their identity," he writes, "as long as possible before showing themselves openly." We must consider this carefully. What he uncovers is not a hidden cult, but a forgotten lineage. The knowledge he gains is not distant or speculative. It is in him. And once known, it cannot be unknown. This is the hallmark of what we might call epistemic collapse, a moment when the structures we use to categorize and interpret reality cease to function. Unlike religious revelation, which clarifies, Lovecraftian knowledge destabilizes. It reveals not the mind of God, but the absence of any mind at all. Dagon, as a symbolic figure, embodies the collapse of categories: God and animal, history and myth, self and other, land and sea. His existence exposes the permeability of borders we believed were fixed. The library, once the temple of enlightenment reason, becomes in this cosmology a kind of contagion vector. Books, genealogical records, obscure sermons, all become carriers of infection, not information. The more one reads, the more one sinks. The archive does not preserve knowledge, it dissolves it. In this light, the cult of Dagon is not merely a religious organization. It is a carrier of cognitive contamination. Their rituals, their books, even their symbols are not instruments of belief, but tools of unmaking. Consider the Esoteric Order of Dagon. Its ceremonies mimic Christian forms: altars, hymns, processions, but their content is subversive. They invoke not salvation, but regression, not ascent, but immersion. When Obed Marsh establishes the cult in Innsmouth after his contact with the Deep Ones, he brings with him not doctrine, but contagion. His sermons initiate a cultural infection. The town does not convert, it dissolves. It is not that the old gods return, it is that the illusion of their absence collapses. This mirrors a broader anxiety in Lovecraft's time, the fear that the accumulation of knowledge might not lead to human triumph, but to human erasure. The early 20th century saw a flood of discoveries that challenged previous conceptions of reality: quantum mechanics, relativity, psychoanalysis, and evolutionary biology. Each revealed that the world was older, stranger, and more indifferent than previously imagined. Lovecraft's fiction does not merely reflect this moment, it extends it. In the same way that Einstein's universe undermined Newton's, Dagon's presence undermines the human-centered narrative of Western civilization. Forbidden knowledge becomes not a door to power, but a door to context, and context in cosmic horror is always annihilating. The metaphor of drowning recurs frequently in Lovecraft's fiction, and in the case of forbidden knowledge, it is particularly apt. The mind does not explode upon learning the truth, it sinks, slowly, inevitably, into depths that offer no resistance and no bottom. Dagon is not a destroyer, but a submerger. His truths do not arrive like thunderbolts. They arrive like tides. What makes them unbearable is not their violence, but their certainty. Once seen, they reframe everything. As in the narrator's closing dream vision, "I shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever." Is this a promise or a curse? Lovecraft deliberately leaves it unresolved. That is the function of epistemic collapse. It renders even interpretation unstable. We must pause to reflect on how Lovecraft frames these collapses linguistically. The prose itself often frays at the moment of deepest revelation. Sentences become fragmented, riddled with ellipses and dashes. Words fail. In Dagon, 1919, the narrator stammers, "God, that hand, the window, the window." These are not dramatizations. They are indicators that the mind's semantic scaffolding has broken under pressure. Language, the final refuge of the rational mind, becomes a casualty of contact. Dagon's knowledge does not inhabit language. It corrodes it. And so, even the attempt to record becomes dangerous. The epistemic structure of Dagon's mythos culminates in a final, devastating insight. The truth is not hidden because it is fragile, but because we are. Forbidden knowledge is not protected. It is simply not noticed until it is. The sea is not locked. It is open. The gods do not speak. They hum. The cult does not hunt. It waits. The tragedy of the narrator is not that he sought knowledge. It is that he found himself within it. And so, as we conclude our examination of forbidden knowledge and its function within the Dagonic strand of cosmic horror, we must acknowledge that what Lovecraft offers is not a warning, but a diagram. The cults, the dreams, the mutations, they are not events, they are outcomes. To engage with Dagon, even as a reader, is to begin the process. Knowledge does not liberate, it claims. The archive is not a map, it is a coastline, and the tide is always rising. In the next part of our investigation, we will shift from the philosophical to the literary, tracing how these ideas manifested first on the page. We will examine the earliest appearances of Dagon in text, his case studies in narrative form, and the literary collaborators who ensured that his name, once spoken, would never quite fade from human memory. To trace the literary genealogy of Father Dagon is to unearth a lineage that stretches not only across Lovecraft's own evolving oeuvre, but also into the sediment of mythic texts and ancestral horror traditions. Before Dagon became the brooding sea god of the shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, he first surfaced, albeit briefly and ambiguously, in Lovecraft's earlier work, Dagon, 1919. Though the story is sparse, a mere 2 pages in its original publication, it lays the essential thematic groundwork for the Dagonic horror that would later fully manifest. The unnamed narrator, a traumatized World War I veteran adrift at sea, encounters a risen stretch of seafloor, oozing with slimy secrets of the ages, upon which stands a monolithic idol, a creature vaguely anthropoid, yet covered with scales, with tentacles, claws, and a face too terrible to describe. Here, in embryonic form, is the Dagon archetype, not a character, but a manifestation of deep time, evolutionary dread, and ontological instability. We must pause here and consider Dagon not as a narrative, but as a fragment, a fossilized clue to a submerged cosmology. The seabed that rises is not a miracle, but a return. The idol is not discovered, but re-exposed. The significance lies not in the being itself, but in what it reveals, that the ocean conceals not monsters, but predecessors. Lovecraft does not name the creature Dagon within the narrative. The title is imposed post hoc, offering a false anchor of familiarity. The god of the Philistines, after all, is known, historical, documented. But the being in Dagon resists such anchoring. It is not merely a resurrection of ancient myth, it is a repositioning. The biblical Dagon becomes a vessel through which Lovecraft smuggles something far older, something for which we have no word, except the ones we distort to contain it. This fragmentary appearance anticipates deeper integration in Lovecraft's broader mythos, especially in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, where the sea again serves as the cradle of horror and the repository of unknowable memory. While Dagon is not mentioned directly in this tale, his thematic presence is palpable. The sunken city of R'lyeh, where Cthulhu lies dreaming, echoes the abyssal architecture glimpsed in Dagon and later named in Innsmouth as Yihan Thle. The cultists in Cthulhu, like those in Innsmouth, chant in alien tongues, worship beings that slumber beneath the waves, and receive dreams as transmissions from submerged minds. In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. This line, iconic in its cadence, foreshadows the eventual fusion of sea deities, suggesting that Dagon and Cthulhu are not separate entities, but frequencies on the same cosmic spectrum. This connective tissue thickens further in The Temple, 1920, a lesser-known Lovecraft tale that again places a World War I protagonist at sea, descending into ruins that defy time and taxonomy. There, the narrator finds a sculpture of a youthful, noble figure with fish-like features, an image suggestive of the Deep One's hybrid aesthetics. The face, he writes, was marvelously youthful and regular, yet possessed of an expression which stirred me to the depths with its haunting familiarity. While the name Dagon is never uttered, the pattern is unmistakable. The ocean as threshold, the ruined city as revelation, the architecture as linguistic collapse. The being is not shown, but felt. And that sensation of the uncanny without referent defines the Dagonic register. We must recognize that these early tales are not isolated experiments, but recursive invocations of a submerged myth. Lovecraft's fiction does not build linearly, it spirals. Motifs return in altered forms, reframed by new narrators, new geographies, and new philosophical implications. Dagon, though scarcely named, haunts this spiral. His presence is cumulative. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926, we find a distant echo of the Deep Ones in the hides of the southern seas, ancient beings who speak of sunken cities and forgotten pacts. Though this work resides within Lovecraft's dream cycle, often treated as separate from the mythos proper, it nonetheless contributes to the shared semiotic field in which Dagon operates. Dream and sea collapse into one another. Water becomes metaphor for the unconscious, and fish-like beings become markers of humanity's submerged origins. It is also crucial to observe that the figure of Dagon draws its strength not from direct depiction, but from narrative omission. He is rarely seen, rarely named, and even when mentioned, never explained. This narrative strategy of withholding rather than revealing imbues him with a weight that exceeds his textual footprint. In this sense, Dagon functions more like a gravitational force than a character. Stories curve around him. The reader feels his presence in what is not said, in the awkward ellipses, the disjointed recollections, the suggestive fragments of forbidden texts and coastal rumors. They say he comes with the tide, one Innsmouth resident whispers. No clarification follows. None is needed. The sentence is the story. Through this elliptical structure, Dagon becomes a myth not just within Lovecraft's fiction, but within the reader's own interpretive process. His mythology demands assembly across multiple texts, genres, and narrative voices. Each new story is not a new layer, but a return, a recurrence of the same drowned knowledge, partially resurfaced. This narrative strategy mirrors the very structure of myth itself, a sedimented process, where repetition solidifies meaning and fragmentation invites belief. Dagon's presence across Lovecraft's stories does not offer clarity, it offers density. And that density, in turn, generates authenticity. As we transition to the major case studies in Part 3, Dagon and the Shadow over Innsmouth, we will see how this presence crystallizes into form. What begins as fragment becomes revelation. What was once a symbolic gesture becomes biological inheritance. The next two sections will examine these stories in detail, revealing how Dagon moves from archetype to architect of a fully realized horror ecology. In this evolution, we will find not narrative resolution, but something far more disquieting. The confirmation that myth, once seeded, cannot be contained by the story that first named it. It will rise again. Like the sea. Published in 1919 and written during what Lovecraft described as a period of deep personal despair, Dagon serves as the primordial template for what would become his larger mythos of cosmic horror. Though brief and deceptively simple, the story contains in microcosm the entire philosophical and aesthetic structure of the Dagonic tradition. The narrative centers on a traumatized World War I veteran who, after escaping captivity on the sea, finds himself adrift and eventually stranded on a newly surfaced tract of ocean floor. There, in the midst of an unrecognizable and ancient landscape, he witnesses something that permanently unmoors his psyche. A monumental stone monolith carved with unknown hieroglyphs, and a monstrous being, a hybrid of fish, man, and god, that emerges from the sea to embrace or worship it. I think I went mad then, the narrator states, of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat. Madness here is not the result of violence, but of witnessing a truth the mind cannot accommodate. We must recognize that the horror of Dagon is not located in the creature itself, which appears only fleetingly. The true terror arises from the broader implications the creature represents. The narrator describes the landscape as a region whose marine bottom had not looked like a marine bottom, hinting at an ancient civilization that predates human history. The presence of the idol and the alien inscriptions signal a pre-human epoch, one whose technologies, beliefs, and biological realities remain incomprehensible to the narrator, and, by extension, the reader. This reveals something profound. The story is not about a descent into darkness, but about a world in which darkness is underneath the light we think we know. Lovecraft does not destroy the narrator's world. He simply reveals that the world was never what the narrator believed it to be. Thematically, Dagon introduces the triadic structure that will become central to Lovecraft's later work: encounter, collapse, and compulsion. First, there is the encounter with an alien reality, terrifying not because it is hostile, but because it is older and larger than the human frame of reference. Then comes the psychological collapse, as the narrator realizes that he cannot return to the world he once knew. Finally, and most importantly, comes compulsion, a haunting need to testify, to describe, to warn, even as the act of speech hastens madness. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, he writes, and the reader is invited to inherit that shudder. This progression, encounter, collapse, compulsion, mirrors the transformation seen in The Shadow over Innsmouth and countless other Lovecraft stories. It is not a narrative arc, it is a philosophical process. We must also attend to the story's psychological landscape, which mirrors the narrator's internal disintegration. The narrator is a veteran, adrift not only on the sea, but in the aftermath of mechanized warfare, an era in which traditional values and theological assurances had been shattered by unprecedented violence. The oceanic trench he stumbles into thus becomes a symbolic abyss, reflecting the moral and epistemic void left by the war. His encounter with Dagon is not merely maritime, it is existential. The monster emerges not only from the sea, but from the deep recesses of historical trauma. In this sense, Dagon is an early and unacknowledged war story, one that substitutes trench for trenchless ocean, but preserves the same sense of futility, alienation, and derangement. The narrator's final reflection, his fear that the creature shall call to me in a voice mocking my nightmare, suggests not a conclusion, but a pending return. The story's brevity, often seen as a limitation, is in fact a strategic strength. Lovecraft offers no exposition, no detailed mythology, and no explanation of the being's origin or motives. The effect is that the reader becomes complicit in the epistemic unraveling. We do not learn more than the narrator knows, and what little we do learn is presented in language riddled with adjectives like nameless, blasphemous, and indescribable. These are not literary flourishes, they are semantic failures, signifiers of the inadequacy of human cognition when faced with cosmic reality. Indescribable does not mean hard to describe, it means not describable within this world. This insistence on linguistic breakdown is a hallmark of Dagonic horror. It initiates the reader into a system of knowledge where silence becomes evidence, and forgetting is the only form of self-preservation. One of the most important aspects of Dagon is its relationship to the idea of memory and recursive knowledge. The narrator insists that he cannot forget what he has seen. Sometimes at night I dream of the thing, he writes, and have terrible visions of it. The knowledge does not fade, it returns involuntarily like tidal motion. The sea in Dagon is not a static setting, but a mechanism of recurrence. Even the story's temporal structure loops. The narrator writes from a hotel room, driven by the compulsion to confess before an impending suicide. Yet his final lines suggest that Dagon may have found him again. "It has found me," he declares. "God, that hand! The window! The window!" Whether literal or hallucinated, the monster's return confirms the circularity of cosmic knowledge. One does not escape, one repeats. This narrative. Repetition prefigures the circular logic of The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the protagonist, too, returns, not to resist, but to join. Dagon ends with terror. Innsmouth ends with transformation. The trajectory from one to the other represents Lovecraft's evolving understanding of horror, not as a reaction, but as a destiny. In Dagon, the narrator flees the sea. In Innsmouth, he swims toward it. That progression will be the focus of the next section, where we turn to Lovecraft's most complete and unsettling portrait of Dagon's worshippers and the town they remade in the image of the deep. But before we proceed, we must acknowledge that Dagon, despite its brevity, accomplishes something monumental. It opens a crack in the world. It does not name the truth, but it reveals that there is one, and that it is intolerable. In doing so, it inaugurates the entire architecture of Dagonic horror: knowledge without comprehension, contact without closure, transformation without consent. The sea, once a symbol of mystery, becomes a symbol of memory, and the memory is not ours. If Dagon, 1919, is the primordial seed of Lovecraft's maritime dread, The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, is its full flowering, the moment when scattered images, symbols, and implications coalesce into a complete metaphysical ecology. Here, the myth of Father Dagon attains not merely narrative density, but cultural texture. It becomes a living anthropology of horror. The story chronicles a young traveler's accidental discovery of a decaying New England town whose inhabitants bear the unmistakable marks of hybridization with non-human beings from the sea. What begins as a tale of local superstition and xenophobic rumor transforms into a revelation of kinship, culminating in the narrator's shattering realization that he too is of Innsmouth blood. "I am a part of that accursed race," he admits at the end, "and it is my destiny to swim out to sea and dwell with my brethren." This confession is not an outburst of insanity. It is a declaration of inheritance. The reader, by this point, understands that horror has become heredity. We must recognize that Innsmouth is not simply a story about monstrosity, but about assimilation, the gradual dissolution of distinction between human and deep one, between the land dweller and the sea dweller, between knowledge and transformation. Lovecraft structures the narrative as a descent into revelation, beginning with the narrator's mundane curiosity and ending with his acceptance of cosmic identity. The story's architecture mirrors a ritual initiation: the arrival in the town, the encounter with forbidden knowledge, the moment of pursuit, the dream of the deep, and finally the revelation of kinship. Each stage functions as a symbolic death. Each revelation removes another human illusion of difference, of autonomy, of safety. "I had seen the fishy eyes and flattened noses," he recalls, "and knew that these were no mere deformities of degeneration. The physical becomes metaphysical. Biology becomes destiny." Historically, The Shadow over Innsmouth was composed at the end of Lovecraft's most mature creative period, reflecting not only his narrative mastery, but also his evolving philosophical coherence. Whereas Dagon presents horror as intrusion, something from the outside breaking into the known world, Innsmouth presents horror as revelation from within. It is not the alien that invades, it is the human who discovers he was never truly human. This reversal marks a profound evolution in Lovecraft's mythos. The cosmic is no longer external space, but internal continuity. The deep sea is not a frontier, but a mirror. The story's 1931 composition date, amid the lingering malaise of the Great Depression, reinforces this shift. The decaying town becomes an allegory for a civilization confronting its own obsolescence, its economic and moral isolation symbolized by salt-crusted facades and brine-rotted churches. The Esoteric Order of Dagon is not a cult in the sensational sense. It is an adaptation, a form of survival in a dying world. Consider the figure of Captain Obed Marsh, founder of the Esoteric Order and patriarch of the town's transformation. His voyages to the South Seas, his alliances with the Deep Ones, and his introduction of foreign rights to Innsmouth echo the colonial anxieties of Lovecraft's era. Marsh is both trader and traitor, bridging two worlds through commerce and ritual. "They was kinder gods and kinder devils," one town elder tells the narrator, "and they give in return fish and gold." The language here is transactional, almost banal. Dagon's worship is not born of devotion, but of necessity. The horror lies not in the deal itself, but in its logic. Humanity's willingness to trade its integrity for survival. It is not rebellion, it is economy. Through Marsh, Lovecraft converts maritime myth into sociological parable. The Deep Ones do not conquer Innsmouth. Innsmouth invites them. The narrative's pivotal scene, the nocturnal pursuit through the streets of Innsmouth, functions as both literal chase and psychological passage. As the narrator flees through narrow alleys and locked hotel doors, he hears the wet, dragging footsteps of his pursuers, their inhuman breath filling the night. Yet beneath the adrenaline lies an unspoken recognition. He is running from his own reflection. The fear is not that they will catch him, but that he will join them. Lovecraft's genius lies in embedding this recognition in the story's sensory detail. The glassy eyes glimpsed through cracks, the pallid gills fluttering in the moonlight, the air rank with the odor of the sea. These are not Gothic flourishes. They are biological signals. The narrative's terror operates as both pursuit and infection. The reader feels, as the narrator does, that escape is impossible because the transformation has already begun. We must pause to note that the story's final revelation, the narrator's acceptance of his Deep One heritage, marks a radical departure from traditional horror resolution. There is no exorcism, no destruction of the monstrous. Instead, there is union. "I shall swim out to that brooding reef in the sea," he writes, "and join my kin beneath the waves." This conclusion redefines the genre's teleology. The goal is not restoration, but return. The surface world is not saved. It is revealed as temporary. In embracing his transformation, the narrator transcends the false dichotomy of sanity and madness, of human and inhuman. He becomes the bridge between the species, the voice through which Dagon's theology of continuity is articulated. It is not the monster who wins. It is evolution itself. This ending has profound philosophical implications. It suggests that horror, at its deepest level, is not the fear of extinction, but the fear of continuity. The recognition that humanity is not the pinnacle of creation, but a transitional phase. Dagon, in this sense, is not a destroyer, but a midwife. The narrator's madness is the rational response to cosmic perspective. His dreams of Y'Hanthle, vast, still halls of basalt, lit by the green glow of the deep, are not nightmares, but revelations of the true home of consciousness. Here, Lovecraft collapses the dichotomy between fear and awe, depicting a metamorphosis that is both terrifying and transcendent. "I shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever," he writes, inverting the Christian promise of heaven into an abyssal vision of peace. This reveals something profound. In Lovecraft's world, salvation and damnation are the same words spoken at different depths. Finally, the shadow over Innsmouth serves as the narrative linchpin that binds Lovecraft's mythos into coherence. It synthesizes themes from Dagon, the temple, and the call of Cthulhu, establishing Dagon not as isolated deity, but as regional manifestation of the same cosmic principle that governs Cthulhu's dreaming and the universe's indifference. It grounds the metaphysical in the geographic. New England becomes the shoreline of infinity. In doing so, it transforms folklore into ontology. The horror of Innsmouth endures not because the story ends in revelation, but because revelation offers no closure. The waves do not recede, the knowledge does not fade, and as the narrator swims toward Y'Hanthle, so too does the reader drift toward understanding, reluctant, horrified, yet unable to turn away. In the next section, we will trace how this mythology survived Lovecraft's death, evolving through the pens of collaborators and successors who reinterpreted Father Dagon for new generations. Each retelling will serve not as revival, but as recurrence, the tide coming in again, familiar, yet never the same. The mythology of Father Dagon did not subside with Lovecraft's death in 1937. Like the tide that defines his theological symbolism, Dagon has returned in successive waves, mutated, reframed, and recontextualized by those who inherited the mythos. These later writers, most notably August Derleth, Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and others, continued the project of myth-making, sometimes expanding Lovecraft's vision, other times constraining it. The posthumous fate of Dagon reflects a tension at the heart of all collaborative mythologies. Between preservation and interpretation, between the unknowable and the systematized, we must recognize that what survives in these expansions is not just a character, but a philosophical structure, Dagon as a signifier of return, hybridity, and cosmic anonymity. August Derleth, the most prominent of Lovecraft's literary executors, played a paradoxical role in the continuation of the mythos. On one hand, he was instrumental in preserving Lovecraft's legacy, editing, publishing, and promoting his works through Arkham House. On the other, Derleth imposed a theologically dualistic framework onto Lovecraft's amoral cosmos. He categorized the Great Old Ones, including Dagon, into elemental elder gods of air, earth, fire, and water. Dagon, under this scheme, became a water elemental aligned with the forces of evil, opposed by benevolent good deities. While this reframing made the mythos more accessible to readers steeped in Christian cosmology, it fundamentally misrepresented Lovecraft's intent. Dagon was never evil in the moral sense. He was indifferent. To moralize him is to strip away the cosmic nihilism that defines his symbolic force. Derleth's most direct invocation of Dagon appears in stories like The Fisherman of Falcon Point, where the sea god's influence is presented through inherited bloodlines and strange coastal rituals. Yet these tales lack the metaphysical weight of the shadow over Innsmouth. Dagon becomes a character rather than a process, a known quantity, summoned and confronted, rather than an incomprehensible revelation. This shift marks a significant evolution in the mythos. From existential horror to supernatural horror, the former destabilizes, the latter entertains. Derleth's Dagon can be named, classified, and even defeated. Lovecraft's Dagon, by contrast, is never fully seen, never fully known, and never fully gone. More philosophically aligned with Lovecraft's vision is the work of Ramsey Campbell, who transplanted the mythos into a British context. In stories such as The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, and The Tugging, Campbell evokes Dagon's presence through ruined chapels, submerged altars, and ancestral pacts. Here, Dagon is not directly named but implied, a recurring motif of aquatic dread that mirrors the psychological decay of his characters. Campbell does not moralize the mythos, he localizes it. His towns are not Lovecraft's Arkham or Innsmouth, but Goatswood, Brichester, and other fictional locales inspired by the decaying English countryside. Yet, the atmosphere remains intact. The sea in Campbell's fiction is again a place of remembering rather than discovering. It calls to something already inside the character, and perhaps the reader. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Dagon re-emerged in more experimental forms. Writers like Caitlin R. Kiernan have explored the Deep One mythos through the lenses of gender, identity, and trauma. In works like Houses Under the Sea and The Drowning Girl, the aquatic becomes erotic, uncanny, and deeply personal. Kiernan's approach does not treat Dagon as deity or monster, but as condition, a state of being that merges psychological dissolution with ontological drift. The Deep Ones are not only others, they are selves in flux. Transformation becomes liberation, not damnation. This reframing reflects a broader cultural shift. Cosmic horror no longer articulates only fear of the alien, but also fascination with the mutable. What was once a symbol of contamination becomes, in Kiernan's hands, a metaphor for fluidity. The horror remains, but it is aesthetic, not moral. Contemporary horror writers like Laird Barron and John Langan have also gestured toward the Dagonic lineage, often without naming the god explicitly. In Barron's The Croning and Langan's The Fisherman, one finds echoes of sunken temples, oceanic gods, and the entropic logic of ancestral return. These modern tales often return to the themes of fatherhood and inheritance, casting Dagon not as antagonist, but as legacy. In The Fisherman, a man discovers an arcane ritual at a remote lake, an echo of Dagon's rites relocated inland. The being encountered is not Dagon per se, but what we might call a Dagon function, a presence that offers forbidden knowledge, the restoration of the dead, and eventual dissolution of identity. The continuity lies not in the names, but in the structure, the encounter, the corruption, the recurrence. Even in visual media, Dagon's afterlife persists. Stuart Gordon's Dagon, 2001, a loose adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth, reimagines the story in a Spanish fishing village plagued by ancient sea gods. Though the film adopts a more visceral, action-oriented approach, it preserves the core motif of transformation through revelation. They are not gods, the local priest says. They are older than gods. This single line, though cinematic, captures the essence of Dagon's horror. He is not above us, but beneath us, beneath time, beneath culture, beneath skin. We must pause here to consider what this evolution reveals. Dagon, though rooted in a specific literary context, has become a cultural archetype. He is the aquatic unknowable, the god beneath the god, the returner rather than the conqueror. Writers who invoke him may change his name or geography, but the structure remains. The tide returns, the cult survives, the knowledge seeps through. Dagon persists not because he is a strong character, but because he is a void that demands metaphor. He is what fills the space where theology once sat, where science now falters, where identity dissolves. As we prepare to explore Dagon's cultural and psychological afterlife in Part 4, we must recognize that the myth has left literature. It now circulates through games, films, forums, and fan communities, living not as text, but as meme, motif, and myth fragment. The sea has claimed not just Innsmouth, but us. And in each retelling, Dagon's shape shifts once more, not to reveal himself, but to show us how little we were ever truly ourselves to begin with. No mythology remains fixed in its textual origin. Over time, stories unmoor from the page, seeping into rumor, performance, belief, and subcultural imagination. The myth of Father Dagon, once confined to Lovecraft's fictions, has entered this fluid space. It now occupies a liminal zone between literature and folklore, between conscious homage and unconscious recurrence. This is the strange cultural afterlife of Innsmouth and its deep ones, a modern mythology that has taken on the language of hoax, legend, and sighting. Consider carefully. What once was fiction is now retold as memory, seen not in books, but in forums, podcasts, and grainy seaside photos. Dagon has passed into the world not as a god, but as a story people tell about the sea when no one else is listening. The phenomenon began, arguably, with attempts to locate Innsmouth. Lovecraft scholars and amateur occultists alike have tried to match the fictional town to real places, most frequently Newburyport, Massachusetts, which Lovecraft visited in 1928. Others point to Gloucester or even Marblehead, citing architectural similarities and the presence of old fishing families with opaque histories. In online forums and YouTube documentaries, one finds accounts of derelict coastal churches, strange sea-worshipping sects, and families with webbed fingers or rare genetic traits. These are not academic analyses, they are folk investigations. A Reddit user claims to have found the remnants of the Esoteric Order's meeting hall near Plum Island. Another reports a sighting of humanoid figures surfacing during a storm surge in 1997. No evidence is ever conclusive, and yet the stories persist because in folklore, plausibility is less important than pattern. This blurring of fiction and reality is not new. It is how legends have always evolved. The Rosicrucians, the Priory of Sion, the Men in Black, all began in texts and were absorbed into subcultural consciousness as though they had always been part of lived reality. Dagon's myth follows a similar arc. It is not just retold, it is re-encountered. Coastlines become haunted by suggestion. Old naval records are reinterpreted through Lovecraftian lenses. A 19th century whaler's diary referencing the fishmen of the trench becomes evidence. Tidal patterns, when erratic, are framed as signs. This is not scholarship. It is participatory mythology. The myth is no longer something to be read. It is something to be found. The internet, of course, has accelerated this process. Creepypasta communities and horror ARGs, alternate reality games, frequently employ Dagonic motifs. Deep-sea research gone wrong, forgotten coastal towns, ancient marine altars found in sonar scans. One popular YouTube series, The Salt Sermons, documents a fictional investigation into an abandoned fishing village whose residents vanished in 1983. The series never names Dagon directly, but viewers recognize the fingerprints, abandoned churches with strange glyphs, VHS footage of chanting near tide pools, a preacher who claims, "The old ones are not dead, they're only dreaming at depth." These hints work not because they confirm the myth, but because they echo its structure: slow revelation, familial secrecy, the horror of biological return. Urban legends often reveal what a culture most fears or desires. In Dagon's case, the legends suggest a fear not of monsters, but of returning to something older than we are. This distinguishes Dagonic urban legends from typical sea monster tales. The point is not that something strange is in the water. The point is that we came from the water, and it might want us back. Fishermen in Newfoundland speak of the old ones of the bay, and locals in coastal Oregon whisper about those who don't drown because the sea remembers them. These stories, while modern, echo ancient motifs, sirens, selkies, and the liminal humans of water myth. The deep ones, for all their alien horror, are part of this universal taxonomy. Their persistence in legend suggests a deeper human unease with identity itself. Where do we end and the ocean begin? We must acknowledge, too, the irony of myth becoming reality through repetition. Dagon was not a god before Lovecraft gave him form, a misreading of a Philistine agricultural deity, shaped into something monstrous by literary intent. But that literary fiction, once released into the world, began to behave like folklore. It traveled, it adapted, it embedded itself into regional narratives. Like the sea itself, the myth reshapes every shoreline it touches. What begins as fiction becomes folk memory. What was written as horror becomes whispered as history. This reveals something profound. Belief does not require truth. It requires pattern, emotion, and repetition. Dagon thrives because he fills a void, an absence of certainty in our relationship to the sea, the body, and time. The epistemic ambiguity of these sightings and legends mirrors the very structure of Lovecraftian horror. The stories do not resolve. The truth is always partial, deferred, distorted. A photograph is always just unclear enough. A document always just out of reach. The ambiguity is not a failure of verification. It is the point. Dagon, if he were conclusively proven real, would lose his power. His horror is in the suggestion, the ripple, the dream remembered at low tide. The myth survives because it is always just beyond the frame. As we move into the next section on how Dagon has been adapted into games, film, and music, we will see how his presence has shifted once again. From whispered legend to aesthetic motif, from ritual to interface. But even in those forms, something of the old rhythm remains, the salt in the air, the weight of the water, and the knowledge, half buried, that the story might not have started with Lovecraft after all. Perhaps it was simply waiting for language, for medium, for return. In the century since Father Dagon first emerged from the depths of Lovecraft's imagination, his influence has extended far beyond literature. Through film, games, and music, Dagon has shed his initial textual constraints and become something more fluid, an audiovisual archetype, a cultural signal that functions across genre and medium. Importantly, these adaptations do not merely retell Lovecraft's stories. They reinterpret them, remix them, and in some cases, retranslate the myth into entirely new symbolic languages. The result is a Dagon that persists not as a static deity, but as an evolving aesthetic, an atmosphere of aquatic decay, biological ambiguity, and ritualistic dread. This reveals something significant. Dagon thrives not through theological coherence, but through sensory suggestion. The salt, the tide, the chanting. It is not belief that spreads his myth, but experience. Film offers the clearest example of Dagon's adaptive persistence. Stuart Gordon's Dagon, 2001, loosely based on The Shadow over Innsmouth and the earlier short story Dagon, transplants the narrative to a fictional Spanish village called Imboca, a thinly veiled homage to Innsmouth. The film reimagines the Esoteric Order of Dagon as a coastal cult that has struck a pact with sea gods for prosperity, in exchange for women and genetic continuity. Here, Dagon becomes more explicit, monstrous, tentacled, and godlike. But the core themes remain: transformation, biological inheritance, and descent into submerged identity. The protagonist, like Lovecraft's narrator, slowly realizes his own connection to the deep ones and ends by embracing his oceanic ancestry. "I was born of the sea," he declares in the final scene, "and I will return to it." The narrative arc preserves the Dagonic logic of self-annihilation through knowledge, but renders it with visceral, corporeal clarity. Other cinematic works invoke Dagonic horror without naming it. Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, 2017, though framed as a romance, resonates with Deep One mythology, a humanoid amphibian deity held captive by modern institutions, venerated in whispers, feared by those who misunderstand it. The film reimagines the monstrous as sacred, seductive, and sympathetic, a reversal of Lovecraft's original fear, but still operating within the same symbolic ecosystem. The Deep One no longer threatens humanity. It questions its definitions. Similarly, The Lighthouse, 2019, directed by Robert Eggers, employs nautical isolation, dreamlike madness, and sexualized oceanic imagery in a way that echoes Innsmouth's spiritual decay, even without direct reference. These films demonstrate that Dagon's cinematic afterlife is not confined to monsters. It is also visible in mood, in metaphor, in waterlogged hallucinations that never quite explain themselves. Video games, with their immersive affordances, have proven particularly effective in channeling Dagon's mythos. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, is the most direct adaptation, allowing players to explore Innsmouth's shadowed streets, infiltrate the Esoteric Order's headquarters, and survive the infamous hotel escape sequence first imagined in The Shadow over Innsmouth. The game captures not only the narrative structure of Lovecraft's work, but its psychological weight, hallucinations, creeping insanity mechanics, and the irreversible nature of transformation. Here, madness is not a failure state, it is part of the mechanics. Other games, such as Bloodborne, 2015, The Sinking City, 2019, and Sunless Sea, 2015, adapt Dagonic motifs without direct attribution. In Bloodborne, aquatic deities descend from the cosmos. Rituals involve transformation through communion with alien entities, and the player's mind fractures as knowledge accumulates. The deep is no longer merely beneath. It is within. These ludic adaptations expand the myth by simulating the descent. The player, like the narrator, does not witness horror, they participate in it. Music, too, has served as a vessel for Dagon's resurgence, particularly within subgenres of metal and dark ambient music. Bands such as Nile, Sun O, and the Great Old Ones incorporate Lovecraftian themes into both their lyrics and sonic design. Dagon, a track by the latter, uses dissonant guitars, ritualistic chants, and ambient textures to evoke a sense of underwater immensity. The lyrics speak of depths beyond death and a god who does not wake but waits. Importantly, the music does not offer narrative, it offers immersion. In these sonic environments, Dagon becomes less a character than a frequency, a set of auditory cues that simulate drowning, submersion, and the disintegration of self. This reflects a deeper truth. The ocean is not merely a symbol, it is an acoustic space. The sound of water, low droning, and indecipherable chants mimic the unknowable languages of Yahanthle. Dagon's presence is felt not as plot, but as pressure. Across all these media, the recurring tropes remain consistent. Ancient submerged cities, cults of secrecy, hybrid forms, dreams that lead to irreversible truths. Dagon is not always present by name, but his symbolic structure remains intact. He is the patron of entropy disguised as rebirth. He is the god of knowledge that cannot be survived, and crucially, he adapts. Each new medium remakes him, but never destroys him. This is not a weakness of the myth. It is its strategy. By resisting closure, by inviting reinterpretation, Dagon becomes generative. He is less like a canonical figure and more like a tectonic force, reshaping narrative landscapes from below. Why does Dagon persist in modern media? The answer lies in his ability to encapsulate multiple anxieties simultaneously: ecological collapse, bodily transformation, genetic inheritance, epistemic instability. He is a myth that scales with fear. In an era of rising seas, decaying institutions, and technological transparency, the idea that something older than us might still be watching, waiting, or remembering is not only compelling, it is inevitable. The deep ones are not fantasy, they are metaphor. And the metaphor grows stronger as the boundaries we rely on between self and other, mind and body, land and sea, begin to blur. As we turn next to subcultural and academic appropriations, we will see how Dagon's myth moves not just through horror fiction and entertainment, but through belief systems, academic discourse, and ironic religious forms. What began as cosmic horror has become a cultural grammar, a way to speak about the unspeakable, to think the unthinkable. The sea calls, the audience answers, and Dagon continues, not because he must, but because he can. Father Dagon, once a fictional construct lurking in Lovecraft's lesser-known corners, has now escaped the page entirely, embedding himself in subcultures, academic discourse, and even quasi-religious practices. His presence is no longer confined to horror literature or entertainment. It circulates as a symbolic resource, a conceptual figure deployed to explore identity, power, memory, and the unknown. In these appropriations, Dagon's meaning does not settle. It multiplies. He becomes, paradoxically, both joke and threat, text and ritual, metaphor and method. We must recognize that this persistence is not accidental. Dagon's fluid, unfixed ontology makes him ideal for cultural remixing. He is a myth who resists being closed. Perhaps the most curious manifestation of Dagon in contemporary culture is in the realm of parodic or ironic religion. Groups like the First United Church of Cthulhu, or the Esoteric Order of Dagon, which began as fan communities or elaborate satire, have taken on a strange second life. Some engage in ritual-like behavior, holding mock sea baptisms, or chanting fabricated prayers to Father Dagon during online gatherings. While these acts are rarely meant to express true belief, they function as ritual parody, a way to simultaneously critique and participate in religious structures. A member of one such group wrote, "We don't worship Dagon, we acknowledge the futility of worship." This reveals something profound. Dagon has become a language for articulating postmodern alienation, not just from the cosmos, but from meaning itself. Irony does not dilute the myth, it disperses it. Academia, too, has not remained untouched. In fields such as literature, religious studies, media theory, and anthropology, Dagon appears regularly, not as object of devotion, but as case study, liminal symbol, and speculative boundary marker. Scholars have examined Dagon and the deep ones as metaphors for miscegenation, the posthuman body, climate anxiety, and the collapse of Enlightenment rationality. In seminars on horror fiction, Dagon often functions as a lens through which students examine anxieties about race, degeneration, and hybridity in early 20th century America. In cultural theory, Dagon becomes a stand-in for what philosopher Eugene Thacker calls the unthinkable world, a world in which human categories are no longer sufficient. Dagon is not evil, he is illegible, and that illegibility is where his true horror and theoretical richness resides. In digital subcultures, particularly among younger generations on platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and Discord, Dagon is often invoked in mimetic form, as humorous lore, absurdist myth, or nostalgic deep cut for horror aficionados. One viral TikTok trend in 2023 involved users staging Innsmouth transformations, applying fisheye lenses and aquatic filters while chanting nonsense phrases in mock ritualistic tones. What appears trivial is, in fact, revealing. This playful content reflects a generational shift in how myth functions. It no longer depends on sacredness. It depends on recognition and repetition. A meme is not a diminishment of myth. It is its new delivery system. Dagon, through his very obscurity, becomes a symbol of cultish knowledge. Knowing the name is itself a kind of belonging. This circulation also intersects with queer and trans subcultures, where the Deep One transformation, once written as a grotesque descent into monstrosity, is now reinterpreted as a metaphor for bodily transition, self-reclamation, and the embrace of otherness. The Innsmouth look, once a marker of cursed inheritance, becomes a badge of submerged identity, hidden, evolving, and eventually triumphant. Artists and writers within these communities have taken Lovecraft's fear of hybridity and flipped its valence. Dagon becomes not a patriarchal tyrant, but a symbol of fluidity, of shedding false flesh to become something truer. Here, horror is reclaimed, rewritten, and reinscribed as a liberatory transformation. What Lovecraft feared, others now celebrate. But not all appropriations are so playful or subversive. In darker corners of the internet, Dagon has occasionally been invoked by fringe occultists and conspiracy theorists who blend his myth with real-world fears about deep-sea exploration, elite cabals, or ancient technology. These appropriations often reflect paranoia rather than reverence, yet they still follow a familiar logic. Dagon as that which cannot be seen, but whose influence is felt. In these circles, Lovecraft's texts are sometimes read not as fiction, but as coded revelations. "The old ones are returning," reads one cryptic forum post, "and the sea will take back what we stole." Whether sincere or performative, these expressions testify to a myth that functions like a virus, self-replicating, mutating, immune to containment. What unites these diverse appropriations, academic, ironic, conspiratorial, subcultural, is a shared understanding that Dagon is useful. He provides a frame through which to explore boundary collapse, between species, between the sacred and the absurd, between fiction and belief. Dagon is no longer just a figure in Lovecraft's mythology. He is a conceptual tool, a haunted mirror held up to the instability of modern identity. The sea he emerges from is not just ecological, it is discursive, and in it, everything drowns: the real, the imagined, the sacred, and the meme. As we turn to our final section on the enduring psychological and philosophical implications of Dagon, we will leave behind culture and return to the individual mind. For while Dagon has entered society, he has also entered consciousness. And in dreams, in thoughts unspoken, in the quiet moment of standing beside a dark shoreline, he waits, not as presence, but as possibility. If the myth of Father Dagon has proven anything across a century of evolution, from pulp pages to academic citations, meme culture to horror cinema, it is that certain ideas cannot be unwound once known. They persist not through belief, but through implication. To encounter Dagon is to become permanently aware of something beneath the surface of things: a tension, a memory, a truth that was perhaps never meant to be understood. His true horror is not monstrous form or violent intent. It is what he means. And what he means is that the boundary between self and world, between human and other, between mind and abyss, is far more porous than we like to believe. At the heart of Dagon's psychological resonance is the fear of continuity, the realization that we are not singular, not exceptional, not immune. Most traditional horror confronts us with extinction. Lovecraftian horror, and Dagon in particular, confronts us with assimilation. The transformation of the narrator in the shadow over Innsmouth is not an end, but a return. "I shall swim out to that brooding reef," he writes, "and dwell amidst wonder and glory forever." This line is not mere resignation, it is epiphany. The horror is not death, it is survival in altered form. Dagon's grip on the imagination stems from this inversion. We are not haunted by his presence. We are haunted by the suspicion that we were never truly separate from him to begin with. This suspicion becomes philosophical when viewed through the lens of posthumanism. Dagon represents the dissolution of the human as the central axis of meaning. In his mythos, consciousness is not privileged, it is incidental. Species boundaries are not sacrosanct, they are transitional. The deep ones do not conquer. Humanity, they absorb it, generationally, biologically, silently. This erosion of category reflects what thinkers like Foucault and Haraway have long suggested. That identity, especially in modernity, is not fixed, but constructed, performed, inherited, and overwritten. The Innsmouth look, once a grotesque marker of tainted blood, now reads as the visual index of ontological drift. And in drifting, it implicates all of us. We must consider, too, Dagon's psychological alignment with oceanic feeling, a term coined by Romain Rolland and later examined by Freud to describe the experience of dissolution into the whole, often reported in mystic states. Freud dismissed it as regressive, a return to infantile narcissism. But in the context of Dagon, it becomes something else, the mind confronting the vastness of time, biology, and history all at once. The sea is not merely metaphor, it is the medium through which this experience takes form. Salt water is in our blood. The rhythms of the tide match the rhythms of our breath. When Dagon rises from the sea, he does not arrive. He reminds. And that reminder destabilizes the ego. The self is not a fortress. It is a membrane. In dreams, and this is no exaggeration, Dagon often reappears. Not in his full mythic form, but in motifs, vast underwater cities, genetic memory, amphibian eyes watching from the deep. Countless readers have reported recurring dreams after first encountering the shadow over Innsmouth. The cities are not terrifying. They are oddly familiar. This dream language, half buried and suggestive, mirrors what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, a repository of archetypes and symbolic forms shared across cultures and eras. Dagon, though modern in textual origin, resonates like an archetype. He is the fish god, the sea father, the returner. He does not need to be believed to function. He only needs to be known. Consider carefully, even those who reject cosmic horror as implausible often find its imagery strangely persistent. Dagon lingers not because he is real, but because he rhymes with the shape of modern anxiety. In an era of climate collapse, rising oceans, gene editing, and blurred identities, the themes of transformation, contamination, and descent into the ecological real strike a chord. We fear what we are becoming, not monstrous, but merged. And Dagon, patient and silent, becomes the patron of that fear. He represents the recognition that the monstrous is not beyond us, but after us, in the sense of succession. We must pause here and acknowledge that Dagon is not conclusive. He does not offer closure. His mythology is structured as a spiral. Each new telling returns to the same reef, the same transformation, the same silence. The myth never ends because it was never about ending. It was about circulation. Like the tides, it comes back. The philosophical horror of Dagon is not that he rules from beneath the sea. It is that the sea was never beneath us. It was before us, and it will be after. To know Dagon is to realize that time, identity, and memory are all fluid. There is no shore. There is only current. So, what is left for us in the wake of Dagon's myth? Not answers, not safety. Perhaps only awareness that to live in the modern world is to stand with the water at our feet and the sound of distant chanting on the wind. The gods we forgot remember us, and whether we believe or not, the sea is rising. We do not need to swim. We only need to remember that we already did.